Passwords. It's 2014 and we're still talking about passwords. I mean, I'm embarrassed. Are you embarrassed? I mean, how did we get here? So we started this paper. We wanted to look at the giant mess of best practices and analogies and flame wars and all sorts of stuff discussing passwords on the internet and try to figure out what works, what does not work, what do we know, what do we not know, and what is still unknown. And there's a bunch of stuff in the paper, and we tried to drill down on password composition policies and expiration policies and phishing and everything else. But I'm not going to go into all of that. It's a pretty dense document, so I'm just going to kind of try to cover one small slice of it. And the whole business about strength, and we seem to talk about password strength a lot, and there's all sorts of stuff out there, but it seems to me to kind of come down to essentially 4 basic questions. Let me kind of drill down on that. It's like, when is strength really a factor? There are a lot of attacks where it's not. How do we measure strength? How much strength do we need? How do we achieve that needed amount? If we could answer these 4 questions, it would seem to me that we'd be further along than much of the discussion that we see out there. I mean, first of all, it is the first of those questions. It's a little obvious, but it can never be overstated in my view. It's like when is strength the factor? There are a lot of attacks, for example, database breaches and keyloggers and phishing and things like that, which are entirely orthogonal to strength. The strength of the password really just doesn't matter at all. So all those breaches you hear about, RockQ, which leaked 32 million, and CyberVar, which is 1.2 billion passwords, strength had absolutely nothing to do with it. People who had strong password and weak passwords suffered exactly the same fate at exactly the same time for exactly the same reason, and strength had absolutely nothing to do with it. But there are a lot of attacks where strength is a factor. And one thing, I mean, in our kind of survey and kind of ground up approach to looking at the research literature, one thing that did kind of emerge is using the kind of the various heuristic measures of entropy that people have been using for a long time, like length times log2 of the size of the character space, are just really, really poor measures of how well a password withstands strength, and have really led us to some really bad conclusions. So, for example, if you look at the data I'm referring to comes from the RockQ distribution, which was a leak of 32 million plaintext passwords. If you look at something like password with an @ and a 0 occurs 218 times in the data set and has a relatively high entropy under this measure, whereas this lowercase 6-letter thing occurs only once, has a very low entropy, but is actually a far harder password to guess in the sense that it's not common at all. In other words, and these aren't cherry-picked examples, there's very, very poor correlation between the factors that people have been using as measures of entropy and actually how difficult things are to guess. And guess which things like John the Ripper and the cracking tools that are out there go by frequency, not by the entropy measures that we've been using. So there's by now kind of a reasonable convergence in the literature around using what are called partial guess numbers, which is looking at the distribution of passwords and trying to figure out how many guesses does it take a bad guy, what percentage of the distribution of passwords does he get with n guesses. And for the RockQ distribution, for example, with 1 guess he gets just under 1%. At 10 he gets 2%. At 1,000 guesses he gets 11%, and so on. And that kind of evolution of how much of the distribution or what percent of accounts he can expect to get as a function of guesses is kind of the correct measure. How much strength do we actually need? And this is another thing where there's been just enormous confusion. There are 2 extremely different types of attacks. There's online guessing and there is offline guessing. And what are the difference? Online guessing, the guy is computing on your hardware. He's computing on the good guy's hardware. He's sending guesses against a web server or something that we control where lockout and rate limiting and forensics afterwards is possible. Offline, he's guessing on his own rig, which can be GPUs and thousands of things and stolen cloud resources and stuff like that. And you might ask yourself, well, why would anyone do it the hard way online when he can do it the easy way? Well, there, of course, in order to do offline, he needs to get access to the file that controls, that contains the passwords. And this is one thing where we kind of thought it was worth really drilling down in detail on when this happens. When is offline guessing really a factor? Because, I mean, a lot of the literature has kind of focused on this, standing up to, trillions of guesses and stuff like that. But it's not always a factor. I mean, generally speaking, well-maintained websites like Amazon, and Fidelity and things like that don't leak their password lists on a regular basis. When is offline guessing a factor? Well, first of all, the file has to leak. We drew this kind of big decision tree here. If the password file does not leak, well, clearly there's no offline attack. The best you can do is show up online. If it does leak and the leak is detected, well, a well-maintained site should force a password reset. It's not trivial by any means, but that's what should happen. You should force a reset across the system so you severely limit the amount of time that he's got to guess anything. Assuming that the password file leaks and it goes undetected, then what really comes down to is how was the thing stored. If it's stored plain text, yet again, there's no real need for an offline attack. He's just got plain text passwords, so he doesn't need to guess anything. He just reads them off. If it's unsalted and hashed, well, a rainbow table pretty much gets you everything. It'll get you 97, 98, 99% of everything that's below 12 characters or so these days. So effectively, that's almost as good as plain text again. If it's hashed and salted, this is the case here, the big red box. This is where offline guessing, the elaborate cracking is actually a factor. And finally, if there's reversibly encrypted. And reversibly encrypted is interesting because it feels like encryption is a lot better than plain text, but it's kind of an odd one. Reversibly encrypted, there are two cases. If he gets in and gets out with the file undetected, he either gets the decryption key while he's there or he does not. If he gets the decryption key, it's back to plain text. He pretty much has everything again. But if he doesn't get the decryption key, well, he still doesn't have a guessing attack. He has ciphertext, but he doesn't have any way of figuring out whether a given ciphertext is password or Snoopy2 or anything like that. So again, he doesn't have an offline attack. So the point I wanted to make in this big decision tree is that offline guessing, which is something that is really the justification for a lot of the efforts to achieve large, super strong passwords occur far more rarely, at least in the decision tree than one might think. And if you look at the suite of recent, password breaches, and there have been many of them. This is just a sampling of some over the last couple of years: RockU, Gawker, Tiania, eHarmony, Cupid Media, blah 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 blah. And we look, well, where do they all fall on this decision tree thing? And RockU was plain text. Gawker was hashed and salted. These guys were plain text. This guy was hashed but not salted. This guy was reversibly encrypted, and so on. And what actually emerges is that actually in a minority of breaches of password breaches that we've had recently was there an offline attack. In other words, it was more commonly the case that even when he got in and got out, there was still either no need for an offline attack or no possibility of an offline attack. And all of these numbers, by the way, are dwarfed by the recent breach of which it appears to be 1.2 billion passwords that were found on this cybervar from this cybervar gang. So that was a long introduction to, well, how many guesses do we actually need to withstand? If the number of guesses is the correct metric, how many do we need to withstand? Long story short, I mean, our justification for it is in the paper, but online breadth first, we reckon stand up to about 10 to the 4. Online depth first, stand up to about 1 million. Offline, you need to stand up to 10 to the 14 or so. And what I want to draw attention to here is, like, what do you notice? Here's an example of a password that'll stand up to 10 to the 4. Here's one that'll stand up to 10 to the 6. Here's one that'll stand up to 10 to the 14. Trivial, easy, pretty hard, and you got to be kidding me. And the main kind of conclusion of this paper is that there's an absolutely enormous gulf between the strength that you need to withstand online guessing and offline guessing. And here is a kind of a visualization of that, where here is log 10 of the number of guesses a password will withstand. And these are kind of relatively simple passwords down here. Once you stand up to 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4, that is 10,000, 100,000, or at the very outside 1 million guesses, the risk of online guessing is essentially gone. But you don't get safety from offline guessing until you reach about 10 to the 14. A properly configured GPU rig will easily reach that. Here's the thing. What happens in between 10 to the 6 when online guessing is really not a factor anymore, and 10 to the 14 before you get safe from offline guessing? Pretty much nothing is the answer. In other words, all of the effort that you put in increasing a password from, let's say, here to there gets you nothing whatsoever. It basically is effort that is, all of the passwords that live in here, and this is probably the vast majority of passwords, they're more than strong enough to stand up to offline, and they're not strong enough to online, but they're not strong enough to stand up to offline. And there are no brownie points for exceeding one threshold and falling short of the other. And this gap is enormous. It's 8 orders of magnitude wide. Anyway, just to How do you achieve the needed measure of strength? Kind of our survey of the literature's composition policies, all that 8-character upper, lower, blah, blah, blah stuff that everybody hates so much. Extremely poor way of getting anything, very poor return on investment. They don't even give good protection against online attacks. Blacklisting is, banning the 10,000 or so most common choices. Actually, seems to be better return on effort to protect against against online guessing. So just to wrap up, conclusions and takeaways. The most important of which I think were, crude entropy measures are completely unsuitable for measuring guessing resistance, and their use should be discouraged. I mean, your kind of conclusions based on this, L times log 2 of the size of the character set are very suspect conclusions and have led us in a lot of really bad directions. Between the thresholds to resist online guessing and offline guessing, incremental improvement in passwords really has very little benefit. There isn't really kind of a continuous measure of strength. There's really two kinds of passwords in the world, ones that will stand up to online and ones that will stand up to offline, and not much in between. Offline guessing is only a factor if the file leaks, the leak goes undetected and is properly salted and hashed. And finally, if passwords are stored plaintext or reversibly encrypted, there's no offline attack. So all of this password policy stuff trying to resist offline attack is unjustifiable in those things. Anyway, that's a quick intro. Thank you very much. Bye.
So this is admittedly a relatively obscure situation that you probably weren't actually looking into, but this doesn't address things like Kerberos, where if you don't have pre-authentication, a user can, or not a user, an attacker can, if they can sniff the transaction between the user and the KDC, then they have a encrypted ticket that they can then do an offline attack on.
Yeah. I mean, so this is not addressing the hash rate stuff. This is kind of addressing the main point where passwords are attacked in the system. Thanks.